Ruth Sawyer's hand tightened on the auction platform rail as the banker's voice carried across Willow Hollow's main square, announcing the foreclosure of Crescent Ranch in 3 weeks, unless she paid $900 she didn't have. The crowd murmured, and Ruth lifted her chin, refusing to let them see her break. Crescent Ranch had been in her family for 2 generations. Her father built it before the war, her mother kept it running after he never came home, and Ruth had spent the last 6 years breeding horses good enough to carry a lawman or outrun a bandit. But a bad winter, a stolen herd, and her mother's medical bills had carved the ground out from under her. The banker adjusted his spectacles. Bidding will commence for livestock, equipment, and land parcels separately. First lot, 12 mares, various ages. Ruth's throat closed. Those mares were her breeding stock, her future. The only reason anyone would hire her to break colts or consult on temperament. Losing them meant losing her reputation as the best horse breeder within 200 miles. A man's voice cut through the murmurs, low and steady. She's not selling. The crowd shifted. Ruth's gaze snapped to the speaker. A stranger stepping forward from the edge of the square, dust on his duster, and a gun belt worn easy on his hips. He had dark blonde hair a little longer than respectable, a weathered face that might have been handsome if it wasn't so hard, and pale eyes that locked on hers with something between challenge and calculation. The banker frowned. "Sir, this is a legal proceeding." The stranger's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "Then, she'll need a lawyer, not a vulture." Heat crawled up Ruth's neck. Shame and anger tangled so tight she couldn't tell them apart. She didn't need a man defending her, especially not one who looked like he'd kill for the right price. But the crowd was watching, and she couldn't afford to throw away help, no matter how unwanted. The banker's face darkened. "Deputy Knox, remove this man." A broad-shouldered figure moved through the crowd, badge glinting on his vest. Deputy Knox had a face like a fist and a reputation for solving problems with his hands. Ruth had seen him throw drunks into the horse trough and shake down drifters for imaginary crimes. He was the kind of lawman who made people nervous in their own town. Knox stopped in front of the stranger, arms crossed. "You got business here? Or are you just stirring trouble?" The stranger didn't move, didn't blink. "I'm Orson Hale. I've got business with Miss Sawyer." Ruth's stomach dropped. She knew that name. Orson Hale was a bounty hunter, the kind who brought men in dead more often than alive, the kind who didn't quit until the job was done. And if he had business with her, it wasn't to help with her mortgage. Knox's eyes narrowed, then state it proper or move along. Orson's gaze slid to Ruth, and for a second she saw something complicated there, something almost apologetic. "I'm here because she's a witness to a crime, and I need her testimony." The square went silent. Ruth's pulse hammered in her ears. She knew exactly what crime he meant, and she knew exactly why she'd kept silent for 8 months. The night she'd seen Henry Blackwood, the territory judge's nephew, shoot an unarmed man outside the saloon, she'd been close enough to hear the victim beg for his life. Blackwood had looked right at her, smiled, and walked away. 2 days later, a drifter named Cole Ferris was arrested for the murder, and Ruth realized that speaking up meant calling a judge's nephew a liar. She'd kept her head down, focused on saving the ranch, told herself it wasn't her fight. But Ferris was still in jail, and Orson Hale was staring at her like she held the keys to every cage that mattered. Knox stepped closer to Orson, voice dropping to a growl. Miss Sawyer's got no testimony to give. She wasn't anywhere near that shooting. Orson's expression didn't change. Funny. 3 people say different. Ruth forced herself to breathe. If Orson pushed this, if he dragged her into court, Henry Blackwood's family would crush her. The Blackwoods owned half the county, funded the church, paid the sheriff's salary. She'd lose the ranch, lose her reputation, maybe lose her freedom if they decided to call her a liar and make it stick. But if she stayed silent, an innocent man would hang. She'd spent 8 months telling herself it wasn't her problem. 8 months pretending she didn't wake up seeing that drifter's face. 8 months hating herself just a little more every Sunday when Reverend Calhoun preached about truth and righteousness. The banker cleared his throat. Deputy Knox, this is disrupting a legal auction. Knox's hand moved to his belt, not quite touching his gun, but close enough to make the threat clear. Hale, you got paperwork for this witness claim? Orson pulled a folded document from his coat. Slow and deliberate. Signed by the territorial marshal. Miss Sawyer's testimony is material to a murder case. That makes her my responsibility until she talks. Ruth's breath caught. Material witness. That meant protection. But it also meant she couldn't refuse. If she ran, Orson could arrest her. If she lied, she'd be charged with obstruction. And if she told the truth, the Blackwoods would make sure she lost everything anyway. Knox snatched the paper, scanned it, then handed it back with a sneer. Marshall's got no authority here. Judge Blackwood runs this county. Orson smiled, and it was the coldest thing Ruth had ever seen. That's why I'm here. The crowd erupted into whispers. Ruth gripped the rail harder, fighting the urge to bolt. She'd spent 6 years building Crescent Ranch into something worth saving. 6 years proving she could run a business without a husband or a father or anyone's permission. She'd buried her mother 3 months ago and kept working through the grief because stopping meant losing everything her family had built. And now, a bounty hunter with a marshal's paper was about to drag her into a fight she couldn't win. Knox stepped between Orson and the platform. You're not taking her anywhere. Orson's hand moved to his gun, not drawing, but resting there, easy and practiced. I don't want trouble, Deputy. But I will finish my job. Ruth's voice cut through the tension, sharper than she intended. Stop. Both men looked at her. The crowd quieted. Ruth straightened, pulling the shawl tighter around her shoulders, trying to look like a woman who had a plan, instead of one who was drowning in choices that all led to ruin. She met Orson's gaze. What happens if I testify? Orson's expression softened, just a fraction. Cole Ferris goes free. Henry Blackwood stands trial. And me? Marshall offers protection until the trial's over. After that, you go home. Ruth wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe there was a version of this where she did the right thing and still kept the ranch, still kept her life. But she'd lived in Willow Hollow long enough to know how power worked. The Blackwoods didn't lose. They didn't forgive. And they didn't forget. Knox moved his hand to his gun. She's not going anywhere, Hale. Orson's jaw tightened. You want to draw on a territorial marshal's order, Deputy? That's your choice. But it won't end well for you. Knox's face flushed. The Blackwoods own this town. Orson's voice dropped. Quiet and deadly. They don't own her. Ruth's chest ached. She didn't know this man, didn't trust him, didn't understand why he was standing between her and Knox, like her freedom mattered more than his safety. But something in his voice, in the way he said they don't own her, cracked the wall she'd built around the truth. She looked at the banker. "How long do I have?" The banker blinked. 3 weeks, as stated. Ruth nodded slowly, mind racing. 3 weeks to testify. 3 weeks to find a way to pay the debt. 3 weeks to figure out how to survive what came after. It wasn't enough time. But it was all she had. She looked at Orson. "If I testify, I need your word you'll get me back here before the foreclosure deadline." Orson studied her, and she saw the calculation behind his eyes, weighing her request against whatever agenda he was running. Then he nodded. "You have my word." Knox stepped forward. "Miss Sawyer, you don't have to listen to him." Ruth's gaze shifted to the deputy, and she let every ounce of exhaustion and anger show. "What I have to do, deputy, is keep my ranch. And right now, he's the only one offering me a way to do that." It wasn't true. Not really. Testifying wouldn't save Crescent Ranch. But it bought her time. And time was the only currency she had left. Knox's face darkened, but he stepped back, hand sliding away from his gun. "This isn't over." Orson's smile was thin. "No, it's not." Ruth descended the platform steps, legs shaking but steady enough to carry her. The crowd parted, whispers following her like smoke. She reached Orson, stopped close enough to see the fine lines around his eyes, the scar cutting through his left eyebrow, the way his jaw set when he was bracing for a fight. She kept her voice low. "If you're lying to me, if this is some trick to use me and walk away, I will make you regret it." Orson's gaze held hers, steady and unreadable. "I don't lie to witnesses, Miss Sawyer. I just need you to tell the truth." Ruth wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe someone in this town cared about truth more than politics. But belief was a luxury she couldn't afford. She nodded once. "When do we leave?" "Now." Ruth glanced back at the auction platform, at the ranch she might never see again, at the life she'd spent 6 years building. Then she turned and walked beside Orson Hale into the dusty street, feeling the weight of every watching eye, and knowing she'd just made an enemy of the most powerful family in the territory. Orson led her to a pair of horses tied outside the general store, a sturdy bay gelding and a smaller roan mare. He untied the mare, handed Ruth the reins. "Can you ride?" Ruth gave him a flat look. "I breed horses for a living." Orson's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Good. We've got 20 miles before dark." Ruth swung into the saddle, skirts settling around her legs. 20 miles to where? Marshall's camp outside Cedar Bluff. He'll take your statement, then we figure out next steps. Ruth gathered the reins, feeling the mare shift beneath her. "And if I change my mind?" Orson mounted the bay, eyes shadowed under his hat brim. "Then Cole Ferris hangs, and you live with that." The words hit like a fist. Ruth had spent 8 months living with it. 8 months pretending she could bury the memory and move on. But it followed her, woke her at night, sat beside her in church, whispered in her ear every time she looked at herself in the mirror. She nudged the mare forward. "Let's go." They rode out of Willow Hollow in silence, the town shrinking behind them until it was just dust and memory. The land opened up, rolling hills dotted with scrub brush, and the occasional twisted juniper. The sky stretched wide and blue. The kind of sky that made you feel small and free at the same time. Ruth kept her gaze on the horizon, refusing to look back. "Let's go." They rode hard for an hour, the landscape shifting from town to open prairie, grass rippling in the wind like water. Ruth's mare was smooth-gaited, responsive, the kind of horse she'd bred a dozen times. It felt strange to ride someone else's animal, strange to trust something she hadn't trained herself, strange to trust the man riding beside her. Orson stayed quiet, scanning the trail ahead, hand never far from his gun. Ruth watched him from the corner of her eye, trying to figure out what kind of man defended a stranger at an auction, and then dragged her into a fight that could get them both killed. Finally, she broke the silence. "Why do you care about Cole Ferris?" Orson didn't look at her. "I don't." "Then why risk your neck?" "Because Henry Blackwood killed my brother." Ruth's breath caught. The world narrowed to the sound of hooves on dirt and the wind threading through the grass. She stared at Orson, seeing him differently now, seeing the grief carved into the hard lines of his face. "Your brother." Orson's jaw worked. 3 years ago. Different town, same family. Henry's older cousin shot him over a card game, claimed self-defense, walked free because the judge said there wasn't enough evidence. I've been tracking the Blackwoods ever since, waiting for one of them to slip up. And Henry did. Orson's gaze stayed fixed on the trail. He got drunk, got angry, killed a man in front of witnesses. But the only one willing to talk is locked up for the crime. And the only one who saw it all is you. Ruth's throat tightened. "So, I'm not a witness. I'm bait." Orson finally looked at her, and his expression was raw. "You're both." Ruth's hands tightened on the reins. The mare tossed her head, sensing the tension. Ruth forced herself to breathe, to think past the anger rising in her chest. "You could have told me that at the auction, and you would have refused." "Yes." Orson's voice was quiet. "Would you refuse now?" Ruth wanted to say yes, wanted to wheel the mare around and ride back to Willow Hollow, back to the ranch, back to the life she knew even if it was falling apart. But Cole Ferris was still in jail, still waiting to hang for a crime he didn't commit. And Orson's brother was still dead, still unavenged, still a wound that hadn't healed. She met Orson's gaze. "If I do this, if I testify, what happens to you?" Orson's expression closed. "Doesn't matter. It matters to me." Orson looked away, mouth tight. "I clear my family name. Prove I'm not just a killer chasing ghosts." Ruth heard the weight in his voice, the need buried under the hard exterior. He wasn't just hunting justice. He was hunting redemption. She understood that. She'd spent 6 years trying to prove she could run a ranch without a man. Trying to prove her father's faith in her wasn't wasted. Trying to prove she was worth choosing. Maybe that's why she didn't turn around. They rode in silence as the sun dropped lower, painting the prairie in shades of gold and rust. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Ruth's body settled into the rhythm of the ride, muscle memory taking over, letting her mind drift. She thought about the night she'd seen Henry Blackwood kill that man. She'd been in town to pick up medicine for her mother, staying late because the doctor had been delayed. She'd cut through the alley behind the saloon, trying to avoid the main street crowd, and she'd heard the shouting. She'd stopped, frozen, watching Henry Blackwood and a thin man in worn clothes argue over money. over cards, over something that didn't matter. Because 5 seconds later, Henry drew his gun and fired twice. The man crumpled, blood spreading dark across the dirt, and Henry had looked up and seen her. She'd run, sprinted back to her horse, rode home in the dark, locked herself in the barn, and shook until dawn. And when the sheriff came around asking questions 2 days later, she lied. Said she'd left town before sunset. Hadn't seen anything. Didn't know anything. She'd told herself it was survival. Told herself one woman's testimony wouldn't be enough to convict a Blackwood anyway. Told herself she had her mother to care for, a ranch to save, responsibilities that mattered more than a drifter's life. But the truth was simpler, uglier. She'd been afraid. Afraid of losing everything. Afraid of standing alone against power. Afraid no one would believe her. And worse, afraid they would. The sun touched the horizon, bleeding red across the sky. Orson reined in, scanning the landscape. "We'll camp here." Ruth looked around. They were in a shallow draw, sheltered from the wind. A thin line of cottonwoods marking a dry creek bed. It was exposed, isolated. The kind of place that made you feel like the only two people left in the world. Orson dismounted, moved with practiced efficiency. He unsaddled the bay, hobbled it to graze, then reached for Ruth's mare. She slid down before he could help, legs stiff from the ride, and handed him the reins. "I can handle my own horse." Orson's gaze met hers, measuring. "I'm sure you can." But he took the reins anyway, and Ruth let him because she was tired, because her hands were shaking, because she didn't know how to be around someone who just admitted he was using her to avenge his brother. She gathered deadwood while Orson built a fire, the routine familiar and steadying. By the time the flames caught, the sky had deepened to indigo, stars beginning to prick through. Ruth sat across from Orson, the fire between them, feeling the heat on her face and the cold at her back. Orson pulled jerky and hardtack from his saddlebag, offered her half. Ruth took it, chewed mechanically, tasting salt and smoke, and nothing else. The silence stretched, broken only by the fire's crackle and the horses shifting in the dark. Finally, Ruth spoke. "How long have you been a bounty hunter?" Orson stared into the flames. "Since my brother died. And before that, I was a soldier. Fought in the war, came home, tried to build something normal. Then, James got killed, and normal didn't seem worth the effort." Ruth heard the bitterness, the grief wrapped around it like barbed wire. "What did your brother do?" "He was a school teacher. Taught kids to read, helped farmers write letters, spent his Sundays at church. He was good. Better than me." Ruth's chest ached, and the man who killed him walked free. Orson's gaze lifted, sharp and tired. That's what the Blackwoods do. They take what they want, kill who gets in the way, and the law looks the other direction, because money talks louder than justice. Ruth thought about the auction, about the banker's smug face, about Deputy Knox stepping between her and Orson like she was property to be managed. She thought about the whispers that followed her through town, the rumors that she was too proud, too stubborn, too unwilling to marry some rancher who'd take the burden off her shoulders. She'd fought so hard to be independent, to prove she didn't need saving. But independence meant standing alone when the wolves came, and she was starting to realize how lonely that was. What if my testimony isn't enough? Ruth's voice was quiet. What if the judge protects his nephew anyway? Then we find another way. Ruth met his gaze across the fire. What other way? Orson's jaw set. I don't know yet. But I'm not letting Henry Blackwood walk. Ruth believed him. She saw it in the set of his shoulders, the steel in his eyes, the way his hand never strayed far from his gun. Orson Hale would chase this fight until it killed him, or he won. There was no middle ground. She wondered what that kind of conviction felt like. Wondered if she'd ever cared about anything enough to burn her life down for it. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain. Orson looked up, frowning. Storm's coming. How long? Hour. Maybe less. Ruth glanced at the thin line of trees. We need better shelter. Orson stood, scanned the draw. There's a rock overhang a quarter-mile east. Saw it on the way in. They doused the fire, saddled the horses quickly, moved through the dark with the wind rising and the first drops of rain spattering cold against Ruth's face. The overhang was shallow, barely deep enough to fit 2 people and 2 horses, but it was dry and out of the wind. Orson tied the horses close, then crouched at the overhang's edge, watching the storm roll in. Lightning split the sky, thunder following close behind. The rain came harder, turning the prairie into a blur of water and darkness. Ruth sat with her back against the rock, shawl pulled tight, shivering despite the relative warmth. Orson glanced at her, then shrugged out of his duster and held it out. You'll freeze. I've been colder. Ruth hesitated, then took the coat, wrapping it around her shoulders. It smelled like leather and smoke, and something uniquely him. She pulled it closer, feeling the weight of it, the warmth still trapped in the fabric. Orson settled beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body, far enough that he wasn't crowding. They sat in silence, watching the storm, and Ruth felt the tension between them shift, ease, become something less sharp. Thank you. Her voice was barely audible over the rain. For what? For standing up at the auction. You didn't have to do that. Orson's gaze stayed on the storm. Yes, I did. Ruth turned to look at him, seeing his profile in the lightning flashes. Why? Because Knox was going to let that banker strip you bare, and no one else was going to stop him. You don't even know me. Orson finally looked at her, and his expression was complicated. I know enough. Ruth's breath caught. She didn't know what to do with the way he was looking at her. Didn't know how to handle the gentleness buried under the hard exterior. She'd spent so long bracing for betrayal, for disappointment, for the inevitable moment when people stopped pretending to care. But Orson wasn't pretending. He was just sitting beside her in a storm, offering his coat, defending her to strangers, risking his life for a testimony that might not even be enough. She didn't trust it, couldn't afford to, but God, she wanted to. The storm raged through the night. Ruth dozed fitfully, waking to thunder and the sound of rain hammering stone. Each time she woke, Orson was awake too, watching the darkness, hand on his gun, keeping watch. She wondered if he ever slept. Wondered what ghosts kept him awake. Dawn came gray and cold, the storm breaking into drizzle. They rode out stiff and damp, the prairie transformed into mud and standing water. The horses picked their way carefully, hooves squelching, and Ruth focused on the ride, on the rhythm, on anything but the fact that they were getting closer to Cedar Bluff, and the moment when she'd have to decide if she was brave enough to destroy her life for the truth. By midday, they reached the marshal's camp. It was a collection of tents and wagons tucked into a canyon, guarded by men with rifles and wary eyes. Orson led Ruth through the camp, nodding to a few faces, until they reached a large tent at the center. Inside, a man with silver hair and a marshal's badge looked up from a field desk. Orson Hale. You found her. Orson nodded. This is Ruth Sawyer. She witnessed the Blackwood shooting. The marshal's gaze shifted to Ruth, sharp and assessing. Miss Sawyer, I'm Marshal Donnelly. I appreciate you coming forward. Ruth's throat was dry. I didn't have much choice. Donnelly's mouth twitched. Orson can be persuasive. Orson stayed silent, but Ruth felt his presence at her back, solid and steady. She straightened, meeting the marshal's gaze. What happens now? Donnelly gestured to a chair. You tell me what you saw. I write it down, you sign it, and we take it to the territorial judge in Santa Fe. Not Judge Blackwood? Donnelly's expression hardened. Judge Blackwood recused himself. Conflict of interest. Ruth sat slowly, hands folded in her lap. And if I testify, you protect me until the trial's over. After that, you're free to go. Free to go back to a town that'll hate me. Free to lose my ranch because I'll be in Santa Fe instead of Willow Hollow. Free to live with a target on my back for the rest of my life. Ruth's chest tightened, but she nodded. All right. I'll tell you what I saw. She talked for an hour, reliving every detail. The alley behind the saloon, the argument, the gunshots, the way Henry Blackwood had looked at her with cold amusement before walking away. Donnelly wrote it all down, asked clarifying questions, made her repeat certain parts until the timeline was airtight. When she finished, he slid the paper across the desk. Sign here. Ruth stared at the document, at the words that would change everything. Her hand shook as she picked up the pen, and for a second she hesitated, caught between the woman she'd been and the woman she was choosing to become. Then she signed her name. Donnelly took the paper, folded it carefully. We'll leave for Santa Fe in 2 days. Trial's set for next week. Ruth's stomach dropped. Next week? Donnelly's gaze was sympathetic. The territorial judge is pushing it through. He wants this case settled before the Blackwoods can interfere. Ruth looked at Orson. That doesn't give me time to get back to Willow Hollow before the foreclosure. Orson's jaw tightened. I'll handle it. How? I'll pay the debt. Ruth stood so fast, the chair scraped. No. Absolutely not. Orson's expression didn't change. You need $900. I have it. I'm not taking your charity. It's not charity. It's keeping my word. Ruth's hands clenched. I don't need you to save me. Orson stepped closer, voice low and fierce. I'm not saving you. I'm making sure you survive what I dragged you into. The air between them crackled. Ruth wanted to yell at him, wanted to push him away, wanted to stop feeling like she was drowning in obligations she couldn't repay. But she also wanted to lean into him, to let someone else carry the weight for just a moment, to believe she wasn't alone in this fight. Marshal Donnelly cleared his throat. Miss Sawyer, I suggest you accept his offer. You won't be any good to us if you're homeless. Ruth's throat closed. She hated this. Hated needing help. Hated being vulnerable. Hated the way Orson was looking at her like she mattered more than the case. But she was out of options. Fine. She forced the word out. But I'm paying you back. Orson's mouth curved, not quite a smile. We'll figure it out. Ruth wanted to argue, but exhaustion crashed over her, bone deep and total. She nodded once, then turned and walked out of the tent before she could say something she'd regret. Outside, the camp was busy with men preparing for the ride to Santa Fe. Ruth found a quiet spot near the canyon wall, sat on a rock, and let her head drop into her hands. She'd just signed away her safety, accepted money from a bounty hunter she barely knew, and committed to testifying against the most powerful family in the territory. She'd also done the right thing for the first time in 8 months, and that had to count for something. Footsteps approached. Ruth looked up to see Orson standing a few feet away, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. "You all right?" Ruth laughed, bitter. "No." Orson sat beside her, close, but not touching. "For what it's worth, you did good in there. I signed a piece of paper. That's not brave. It's just ink." Orson shook his head. "You stood up when no one else would. That's the definition of brave." Ruth met his gaze. "Why do you care so much?" Orson was silent for a long moment. "Because my brother would have cared. Because someone has to. Because you deserve better than being used and thrown away." Ruth's chest ached. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that his motives were pure, that he wasn't just another man using her for his own ends. But trust was a risk she'd stopped taking years ago. Still, something in the way he looked at her, something in the quiet honesty of his voice, made her want to try. She leaned back against the rock, letting the sun warm her face. "Tell me about your brother." Orson's expression softened. "He was younger than me by 3 years. Smarter, kinder, better at pretty much everything except fighting. He wanted to make the world better, thought education was the key. Spent his whole paycheck on books for his students." Ruth smiled despite herself. "Sounds like a good man." He was. Orson's voice roughened, and the Blackwoods killed him over $30 in a card game. Ruth reached out without thinking, her hand covering his. Orson looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face, and something shifted between them. Something fragile and new. "I'm sorry." Orson turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers. "Me too." They sat like that for a while, hands linked, watching the camp move around them. Ruth felt the weight shift, felt something in her chest crack open just enough to let light in. She didn't know what this was, didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in 8 months, she didn't feel alone. The 2 days before Santa Fe passed in a blur. Ruth helped with camp chores, groomed horses, tried to stay busy enough that she didn't think about the trial. Orson stayed close, not hovering but present, a steady anchor in the chaos. At night, they sat by the fire and talked. Orson told her about the war, about the things he'd seen and done, about coming home to a world that didn't know what to do with soldiers anymore. Ruth told him about the ranch, about learning to break horses from her father, about the year her mother got sick and Ruth had to choose between medical bills and payroll. They talked about loss, about grief, about the shape of their wounds and the ways they'd learned to live with them. And slowly, carefully, they started to build something that felt like trust. On the morning they left for Santa Fe, Orson handed Ruth a rifle. "Do you know how to use this?" Ruth took the weapon, checked the chamber, sighted down the barrel. "My father taught me." "Good. Keep it close. You expecting trouble?" Orson's gaze was grim. The Blackwoods know where we're going. They'll try to stop us. Ruth's stomach tightened, but she nodded. Then, we'd better be ready. The ride to Santa Fe took 3 days. They traveled with a marshal escort, 6 armed men who rode with rifles across their saddles and eyes on the horizon. The landscape shifted from prairie to red rock canyons, the air growing thinner and drier as they climbed into the high desert. On the 2nd day, they were ambushed. It happened fast. One moment they were riding through a narrow canyon, the next bullets were ricocheting off rock, and men were shouting, and horses were screaming. Ruth's mare reared, nearly throwing her, and she fought to control the animal while gunfire exploded around her. Orson grabbed her reins, dragged both horses behind a boulder. "Stay down." Ruth clutched the rifle, heart hammering. "How many?" 6, maybe 8. Orson drew his gun, leaned around the boulder, fired 3 quick shots. "They're not trying to kill us. They're trying to scatter the escort." Ruth peered over the rock, saw men in dusters firing from the canyon rim. The marshals were pinned down, returning fire, but outnumbered. One horse went down, rider tumbling into the dirt. "We can't stay here." Orson reloaded, face hard. "We don't have a choice." "Yes, we do." Ruth raised the rifle, sighted on a figure at the canyon rim, squeezed the trigger. The man jerked back, disappeared. She worked the bolt, fired again, covering Orson as he moved to a better position. They fought for 20 minutes, Ruth and Orson moving together like they'd done this 100 times. She covered. He advanced. He drew fire. She picked off attackers. By the time the ambush broke, 3 men were down and the rest were fleeing up the canyon. Marshal Donnelly rode over, face grim. "Everyone all right?" Ruth lowered the rifle, hands shaking. 1 man down, 2 wounded. Donnelly's gaze shifted to the canyon rim. "Blackwood's men?" Orson nodded. "They'll regroup and try again. Then we ride through the night." Donnelly turned to the group. "Mount up. We're not stopping until we reach Santa Fe." They rode hard, pushing the horses to the edge of exhaustion. Ruth's body ached, her mind numb with fatigue. But she kept moving, because stopping meant dying. Orson stayed beside her, watching the shadows, hand on his gun, ready for the next attack. It didn't come. They reached Santa Fe at dawn, rode through streets just waking, stopped in front of a courthouse with thick adobe walls and iron bars on the windows. Donnelly dismounted. "Miss Sawyer, you'll stay here under guard until the trial. It's the safest place in the territory." Ruth slid from the saddle, legs barely holding her. "When's the trial?" "Tomorrow morning." Ruth's breath caught. "That soon?" "The judge wants this done." Donnelly gestured to 2 deputies. "Take her inside. No one gets in or out without my approval." Orson stepped forward. "I'm staying with her." Donnelly shook his head. "You're a witness too, Hale. You'll be sequestered separately." Ruth's chest tightened. She looked at Orson, seeing the frustration in his eyes, the reluctance to leave her. He'd been her constant for days, the only solid thing in a world that kept shifting, and the thought of facing the trial without him felt impossible. She forced herself to speak. "It's all right. I'll be fine." Orson held her gaze. "I'll see you in court." Ruth nodded, throat too tight to answer. Then she let the deputies lead her inside, into a small room with a cot and a barred window. And she sat down and waited for the fight that would decide everything. The trial started at 9. Ruth was led into a courtroom packed with spectators, the air thick with tension and the weight of watching eyes. She saw Henry Blackwood at the defense table, smug and confident, flanked by lawyers in expensive suits. She saw Cole Ferris in chains, thin and haunted, hope flickering in his eyes when he saw her. And she saw Orson in the back row, still and watchful, his gaze locked on hers. The judge, a stern man with iron-gray hair, called the court to order. The prosecution laid out the case, called witnesses, built a timeline. Then, they called Ruth. She walked to the witness stand on legs that felt like water, raised her right hand, swore to tell the truth. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Clara Reyes, approached with a calm smile. "Miss Sawyer, can you tell the court what you witnessed on the night of March 14th? Ruth's mouth was dry. She glanced at Orson, saw him nod slightly, and she found her voice. "I saw Henry Blackwood shoot an unarmed man in the alley behind the Silver Dollar Saloon." The courtroom erupted. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order. Henry's lawyers leaped to their feet, objecting, demanding, shouting over each other. But Ruth kept talking, kept describing every detail, kept her gaze steady and her voice clear. She told them about the argument, about the gunshots, about the way Henry had looked at her and smiled. She told them about the fear that kept her silent, about the guilt that ate at her, about the choice she was making now to stand up and tell the truth. When she finished, the courtroom was silent. Clara Reyes smiled. "Thank you, Miss Sawyer. No further questions." Henry's lead lawyer stood, a tall man with cold eyes. "Miss Sawyer, isn't it true you've been romantically involved with the bounty hunter, Orson Hale?" Ruth's stomach dropped. "No." The lawyer raised an eyebrow. "You've been traveling with him for days, sleeping in close quarters. Witnesses say you've been quite intimate." Ruth's face burned. "We've been traveling under martial protection. There's nothing inappropriate about it." The lawyer's smile was thin. "So you expect this court to believe that your testimony has nothing to do with helping Mr. Hale pursue his personal vendetta against the Blackwood family?" Ruth's hands clenched. "My testimony is the truth. That's all that matters." The lawyer leaned closer. "Or is it that you're willing to lie to save your ranch? Willing to trade false testimony for the money Mr. Hale has promised you?" Ruth's vision narrowed. She saw the trap, saw the way the lawyer was trying to twist her motives, trying to make her look like a liar and a prostitute in one ugly stroke. And she saw Orson stand in the back row, saw his hand move to his gun, saw the fury on his face. She took a breath, met the lawyer's gaze. "I'm here because a man is sitting in chains for a crime he didn't commit. I'm here because I saw Henry Blackwood murder someone in cold blood and walk away laughing. And I'm here because I'm done being afraid of people like you." The courtroom exploded again. The judge called for order, threatened to clear the room. Henry's lawyer tried to keep pressing, but Clara Reyes objected, and the judge sustained it. Ruth was dismissed, her testimony complete. She walked back to her seat on shaking legs, feeling every eye in the room on her. She sat, folded her hands in her lap, and waited. The prosecution called Orson next. He took the stand, told the court about his brother, about the pattern of Blackwood violence, about the evidence he'd gathered over 3 years. The defense tore into him, called him obsessed, called him a vigilante, tried to discredit everything he said. But Orson didn't flinch. He answered every question with cold precision, dismantled every attack, made it clear that he wasn't chasing revenge. He was chasing justice. By the time the defense rested, the courtroom was a powder keg. The judge called a recess, and Ruth was escorted back to her room. She sat on the cot, head in her hands, replaying every moment, every word, wondering if it had been enough. The door opened. Ruth looked up, expecting a deputy, but it was Orson. He crossed the room in 3 strides, pulled her to her feet, and wrapped his arms around her. Ruth froze for a second, then melted into him, clinging to his solid warmth, letting herself shake, because she didn't have to be strong anymore. "You were incredible in there." Ruth's laugh was shaky. I was terrified. Orson pulled back just enough to look at her, hands framing her face. "You stood up to them. You told the truth. That's all that matters." Ruth's eyes burned. What if it's not enough? What if they let him walk? Then we find another way. Orson's voice was fierce. "But you did your part. You did everything right." Ruth wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe the truth would be enough, that justice would win, that doing the right thing would actually matter. But she'd lived too long in a world where power crushed truth and money bought freedom. She leaned her forehead against his chest. "I'm so tired of being afraid." Orson's arms tightened. "I know." They stood like that until a deputy knocked, announcing the jury was back. Ruth's stomach dropped. "Already?" Orson's jaw set. "That's fast. Is that good? Or bad? I don't know." They walked back to the courtroom together, hands linked, and Ruth felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was it. This was where everything changed. The jury filed in, faces grave. The judge asked for the verdict. The foreman stood. "We find the defendant, Henry Blackwood, guilty of murder in the 1st degree." The courtroom exploded. Henry lunged from his seat, shouting, restrained by deputies. His lawyers protested, demanded appeals, threatened everyone in the room. Cole Ferris collapsed in his chains, sobbing with relief. And Ruth just stood there, numb, unable to process that it was over, that they'd won, that the truth had actually mattered. Orson pulled her against him, and she buried her face in his chest and cried. Not pretty tears, not quiet tears, but huge racking sobs that shook her entire body. She cried for the 8 months of fear, for the man who died in that alley, for Cole Ferris and Orson's brother, and every person the Blackwoods had crushed. She cried because it was over, and she'd survived, and she didn't have to be afraid anymore. When she finally pulled back, Orson was smiling, soft and real. "We did it." Ruth laughed through her tears. "We did it." The judge sentenced Henry to hang. Cole Ferris was released, charges dropped, given a formal apology and compensation for wrongful imprisonment. Orson was commended by the marshal, offered a position as a deputy if he wanted steady work, and Ruth was free to go home. They left Santa Fe 2 days later, riding side by side into the open desert. The sky was impossibly blue, the air clean and sharp, and Ruth felt lighter than she had in years. The weight of the secret was gone, the fear lifted, the constant pressure to survive replaced by something that felt almost like hope. Orson rode quietly beside her, and Ruth kept glancing at him, trying to figure out how to say what she needed to say. Finally, she just said it. "I don't want you to pay off my ranch." Orson looked at her, surprised. "I thought we agreed." "We did. But I've been thinking about it, and I don't want to owe you." Orson reined in, and Ruth stopped beside him. "You don't owe me anything." Ruth met his gaze. "Yes, I do. You dragged me into this fight. You protected me. You kept your word. And now I'm going home with a clear conscience, and you're going back to chasing bounties alone." Orson's jaw worked. "What are you saying?" Ruth's heart pounded. "I'm saying I don't want you to pay off the ranch and leave. I want you to stay." Orson stared at her. "Stay. With me. Help me run Crescent Ranch. Build something that isn't about revenge or survival. Something that's just ours." Orson's expression cracked, and Ruth saw the longing there, the desperate hope he'd been hiding. "I'm not good at staying." "Then learn." Ruth reached for his hand. "I'm not good at trusting, but I'm learning. We can figure it out together." Orson looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her face. "You sure about this?" Ruth smiled. "No, but I'm doing it anyway." Orson laughed, raw and real, and pulled her against him. They kissed there in the desert, under the wide blue sky, and it felt like coming home. They rode into Willow Hollow a week later, side by side, and the town stopped to watch. Ruth held her head high, ignoring the whispers, the stares, the judgment. She'd faced down a courtroom and won. She could handle small-town gossip. They went straight to the bank. Orson paid off the debt in full, and the banker handed Ruth the deed to Crescent Ranch with a sour expression. Ruth took it, thanked him coolly, and walked out with Orson at her side. The ranch was exactly as she'd left it, weathered and worn, but still standing. They dismounted in the yard, and Ruth looked around, seeing it differently now. Not just a burden to carry alone, but a future to build together. Orson followed her inside, set his saddlebags by the door. "It needs work." Ruth smiled. "Everything does." They spent the next month rebuilding. Orson repaired fences, fixed the roof, helped Ruth train the young horses. Ruth taught him the business, showed him how to judge bloodlines, explained the breeding program she'd been developing. They worked side by side from dawn to dusk, and at night they sat on the porch and talked about the future. The town slowly accepted them. Some people never would, but enough folks respected Ruth's testimony, respected the fact that she'd stood up when no one else would. And Orson, for all his hard edges, turned out to be good with the neighbors, patient with the church ladies, willing to help anyone who asked. 6 months after the trial, Orson asked Ruth to marry him. They were in the barn, mucking stalls, covered in dust and sweat, and he just stopped and said, "I want to do this forever." Ruth looked up, surprised. "Muck stalls?" Orson smiled. "Build a life with you." Ruth set down her pitchfork, crossed to him, framed his face with her hands. Yes. They married in the spring. A simple ceremony at the ranch with Marshall Donnelly as witness and a handful of neighbors watching. Ruth wore a new dress, cream cotton with lace at the collar, and Orson wore a clean shirt and the same gun belt he'd worn the day they met. The Reverend pronounced them married, and Orson kissed her under the wide Montana sky, and Ruth felt something settle in her chest that she'd been missing her whole life. Belonging. Partnership. Home. They built Crescent Ranch into one of the best horse operations in the territory. Ruth's breeding program earned a reputation, and Orson's name as a fair dealer brought buyers from 3 states. They hired hands, expanded the herd, bought the neighboring property when it came up for sale, and every night they sat on the porch and watched the sunset. 2 people who'd been broken and afraid learning how to be whole together. Ruth never regretted testifying, never regretted the choice that cost her everything and gave her more than she'd ever imagined. She'd stood up, told the truth, and found a partner who stood with her. That was worth more than safety, worth more than comfort, worth everything. Orson turned to her one evening, 3 years into their marriage, and said, "Do you ever regret it?" Ruth leaned against him, watching the sky turn gold and crimson. "Regret what?" "Choosing this. Choosing me." Ruth smiled. "Not for a second. Even when it cost you everything?" "It didn't cost me everything." Ruth laced her fingers through his. "It cost me the life I was afraid to leave. And it gave me the life I was afraid to want." Orson kissed her temple. "I love you." Ruth turned, met his gaze. "I love you too." They sat like that as the sun sank below the horizon. 2 people who'd been afraid and alone, finding courage and home in each other. The wind whispered through the grass. The horses nickered softly in the corral. And Crescent Ranch stood solid and strong against the coming night. Ruth had fought for the truth, and the truth had set her free. But it was love, messy and hard-won and real, that had given her a reason to stay. And she would choose it. Choose him every single day for the rest of her life.